Sorry? Okay, I think we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second IPv6 webinar of 2013. Today, we are covering the topic IPv6 in the real world. So we want to hear how two operators are dealing with IPv6 in their networks, and also we're going to get an update of what has happened since the world IPv6 launch 1 year to today. So today is also the anniversary of the world IPv6 launch that took place on June 6th, 2012. Let me introduce the gentlemen who will be making the presentations today. Firstly, we'll have Andrew Alston of Alston Networks. He's a consultant to Liquid Telecom. Liquid Telecom is a large backbone fiber provider in Africa, and they are one of the largest fiber backbones. So we'll hear how they get to use IPv6 in their network and how they are working with it. And then right after that, we'll have Dan York of Deploy 360, ISOC Deploy 360, give us an update of what happened with the IPv6 launch last year and what's happened since, and also give us statistics of IPv6 usage in the world currently. And then lastly, we'll hear from Simon Kagwa of Orange, Uganda, and he will give us a perspective of how IPv6 is being used in Orange, Uganda. So let me start off by handing over to Andrew. Andrew, are you ready?
Yeah. Hi, guys. First of all, thanks very much for tuning in, if I can call it that. This is an interesting presentation for me to give on behalf of Liquid, and thank you to Liquid for letting me give this presentation on their behalf. But I think before I start with the slides, I think the most interesting thing about this presentation is that when it was brought up, the question was, what do we actually say? Because for us, IPv6 is just another normal protocol. V4, V6, it shouldn't be anything special. So we are sitting there thinking, how do we talk about IPv6 other than to say, well, it's a normal everyday account? But I'm going to try and give you a bit of history as to what we've done and where we are going. And yeah, so let me start by moving to the first slide here. A little bit of history on IPv6. Liquid first started looking at it in 2008 and applied for the block in 2008. And then we did the initial deployment in 2009. Initial deployment being loopbacks on the routers and some point-to-points. That was very, very basic. It was actually after the last AFRINIC meeting, I believe, I could be wrong there, but the last AFRINIC meeting where we actually did our first full proper deployment of IPv6. And then we turned up our first customer in 2012, and I need to say thank you to Mark Elkins for actually pushing us on that one. Mark suddenly said, well, you know, you say you're doing IPv6, but where's it for the customer? And the customer came and said they wanted IPv6, so we actually have a customer using it in production. We've got IPv6 deployed completely natively in South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and London. And it's always deployed to the edge. There is no point in deploying IPv6 in your core if you're not taking it to your edge and giving your customers access to it. So if we're going to do IPv6, it has to go to the edge. Otherwise, it is simply pointless to do it. So that's always been the strategy right from the start, and that's where we try and what we try and stick to. As I said, moving on to a little bit about the strategy. As I said in the beginning, IPv6 isn't optional. It isn't an add-on. It isn't something special. It just is. It's a part of the network. It is something that we do without even thinking as part of our deployment as we deploy further elements to the network. As a result, we don't purchase hardware and deploy hardware that isn't IPv6 capable. If a vendor comes to me and says, my hardware can't do IPv6, I'm not interested. It's the fastest way to remove yourself from a procurement process with Liquid is to not have IPv6 capability in the hardware. And then we deploy it as part of the standard rollout procedure. As we're rolling out something new, the V6 is deployed. When we're replacing, upgrading, or rebuilding parts of the network, one of the major points is to keep IPv6 in our thought process when planning that. And that becomes particularly important when, I mean, Liquid has been growing at a very fast rate, and a lot of it is through acquisition. And so when we replace and upgrade and rebuild parts of the network where we've gained assets and customers, etc., through acquisition, IPv6 is always a major part of that thought process. And then obviously, where a network is gained through acquisition, we deploy V6 as soon as is practically possible. I'd love to say it's done overnight, but that can be fairly complicated, and I'll get to that in a second. There are some challenges, so it's always as soon as practically possible. Which moves me nicely onto the challenges. Access networks. Access networks are a major challenge with legacy hardware that is probably never ever going to be upgraded to support IPv6. This is in particular, if you look at things like the VSAT platforms. There was a request put in for V6 support on a particular VSAT platform 2 years ago. Still waiting, still asking, and we're kind of the opinion that this is probably never going to happen, sadly, because it's not something that's new that vendors are creating. There's not a lot of sale of it still in the market, and therefore it just doesn't, to backward port V6 into it now, it's just not happening. We also have fairly major problems with IPv6 being protocol immature. Now, that's quite a harsh statement, I suppose. The reality is that there are things that are missing out of IPv6, and every presentation I give about IPv6, I say this, and I'm waiting for the major router vendors and IETF, etc., to actually do something about this. We have a desperate need for VPN v6, LDP6, MPLS, TEV6, etc., particularly when it comes to things surrounding MPLS. There is not much support out there for v6 in that domain, and that creates large problems. As I said, when we were rebuilding and upgrading networks that have been acquired, the deployment can also be complicated by sheer scale. I mean, if I look at the metro network here in Kenya, where I'm sitting at the moment, we're talking about a metro network that is comprised of over 1,600 devices. You're talking 10, 11,000 VPLS sessions. It is a massive network. So that takes time, it takes careful planning. But as we migrate and as we build, that is definitely part of the thought process, and it is where we are heading all the way down to the edge. We also find that another challenge is simply getting customers to actually adopt v6. I mean, you've got customers who, first of all, you find NAT is very prevalent in the African continent. NAT has unfortunately been sold to many people as a security mechanism. It is not a security mechanism. I think everyone at Liquid knows that it is not a security mechanism. And it's a matter of saying to customers that NAT is not the right way forward. It is limiting, it creates a lot of complexity. So you've got to overcome that mindset first. And then you've got to overcome the fact that a lot of the customers are short on resources, the skills to do IPv6, and just that base realization that IPv6 is necessary. The rest of the world, they're out of v4 space. Liquid's actually facing an interesting problem at the moment where we've run out of v4 space in Europe, and we can't get any more from RIPE because there just is no more. RIPE will not give us more v4 as far as we know at the moment. We'll still have a try, but we don't think we're going to get it. So there is literally, you cannot get more v4. We've taken what we can from RIPE. On the African sections of the network, obviously AFRINIC still has v4, but for how long? And even if you can get v4 in Africa, our take on it is if you can't get more v6 in Europe, v4 in Europe, people are going to have to start going v6 only sooner or later. And then the v4 that you're going to get in Africa isn't going to be worth anything anyway. So you may as well do the v6 now. It's just not optional. Where are we going to next? As of this morning, actually, IPv6 was enabled between South Africa and Kenya, and we'll be turning up that BGP. We've got the point-to-point there on the South African Nairobi direct links now. The BGP will go in shortly, and we'll actually be doing the transit for the v6 through South Africa initially, because unfortunately on the Kenyan international routers, which are in London, we don't have v6 support yet. But which leads on to the next point. We are busy building a new high-speed IP network. We're in the process at the moment. It'll be a 10 gig plus backbone, 10 gig in most places, and that will span between Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, and will link to the already established Liquid backbone, which covers South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, the DRC is also, it's not live yet, but it's on the list. Botswana is coming, and this will be part of that one network. And IPv6 will be deployed there all the way to the edge. It'll be an extremely high-speed network, and obviously, as we aim to keep content on the continent, we aim to do as much as possible with it over IPv6 as well. For example, we'd like to see our GHTC caches v6 enabled. We'd love to see the Akamai traffic, which when we're trying to keep content local, we're pulling our Akamai out of South Africa at the moment. We'd love to see more of that coming over IPv6 from South Africa. And so not only is the content kept local, but it's also kept on IPv6. But at the same time, as I've stated, V6 is not viewed as something special. It is viewed as just another mandatory protocol. You can't get away from that. It is what is normal, because otherwise you're going to run into trouble sooner or later. This is just a little bit of a map of our fiber network, and it gives you an idea of the scale of where we're deploying IPv6, as well as just the general network. It goes all the way up from South Africa, hitting Kenya at its north, and goes into Uganda and Rwanda, and that will all be V6 enabled shortly. And so, yeah, that's what I've got to tell you about Liquid and IPv6. I mean, as I said, we've obviously got our challenges, and it's a day-by-day process, but I think we are making big strides, big leaps and bounds. And so, yeah, if anybody's got any questions, I'm quite willing to take them. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very useful presentation, very informative. Andrew needs to leave in a few minutes, so what we'll do, we'll take questions for Andrew before he leaves, and then move on to the next presentation. Maybe I could start off with the questions. Andrew, I have a question. What's the Liquid Telecom policy for assigning IPv6 to customers? What block do you assign customers?
Those are all 48s. Customers get /48s.
Okay, and as Liquid, you have 1/32, or how is that?
We've got 4/32s.
4/32s. Okay.
Yeah, 4/32s globally. Keep in mind, Kevin, that Liquid also has a number of opcos because it's growing very fast through acquisition. So as a result, as we've acquired companies who've had V6 already assigned to them, we've also acquired that address space. So there are 4/32s that we have globally.
Excellent. Okay, I see a number of hands up. Okay, let's just go in alphabetical order. I'll start with Christian.
Thank you, Kevin. Hello, Andrew. This is Christian Jacquenet speaking. I'm in charge of the IPv6 program for the Orange Group. And I was a bit surprised by one of your statements in your challenges slide, where you mentioned that the IPv6 protocol was somewhat immature, at least from several feature standpoints. And you explicitly mentioned, for example, the support of IPv6 VPN capabilities, which is something that has been standardized for quite some time. And as a matter of fact, this is something that we provide to our corporate customers since May 2009, based upon very typical router vendor technologies. Likewise, the LDP specification, at least which has been RFC'd in 5039, if I'm not mistaken, is something which actually can work in an IPv6 environment. So I was actually wondering, and again, the MPLS traffic engineering capabilities, at least from let's say a fast reroute standpoint, is not really dependent on the nature of the or the version of the IP protocol which will be forwarded over the MPLS network infrastructure per se. So I was actually wondering, what kind of issues did you actually experience, mostly to the routing technologies that you are currently operating, or is it really something that you think that you think is missing at least on the standardization front? Thank you.
Christian, I would say that the problem, when I say it's protocol immature, as you're right, there are RFCs out there. Some of the vendors are supporting them, some of them haven't caught up. With a network the size of Liquid's, when you've got a large number of vendors, the support isn't yet consistent. We found that there were different issues with V6, different support, different protocols in the different vendors. For example, as I said, the Alcatel London router, we do not have V6 support there at the moment. We've had an issue, a simple issue with the Howie routers, where you cannot put V6 onto an SVI, you've got to put it onto a sub interface. You've got protocols which, for example, if you're talking about Cisco and Juniper, they generally lead the pack in deploying new features, new RFCs, etc. But you'll find that the support isn't consistent across the vendors. And until you've got something that is mature, like the VPN V6, across all the vendors that we're using, you can't really deploy it because it's got to work across the entire network, because the network is one entity. And that's the type of problem that we are finding. You'll also find that there are certain things which have been missing, and I admit that there may have been announcements that I myself may have missed, but I know as recently as a year and a half ago, there was still, for example, no standardized IPv6 SNMP MIBs and for various protocols. And while that may not seem like a big issue, when you're doing a lot of monitoring, that does create problems. So it's about getting to that maturity level across all the platforms, and I don't believe that it's something that is not going to happen. It will get there, but it does create challenges at the moment in a network that is growing this fast and is this large. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, we can move to the next question. Daniel, I see your hand up.
Sure, Andrew, it was an interesting presentation and great to hear that you've turned up the connection between Kenya and South Africa today. Can you speak about anything, what was involved with getting that connection working between the two countries?
Oh, I mean, that's actually pretty simple. What actually happened when we had the massive fiber breaks on the undersea cables fairly recently, we had a situation where we desperately needed to bring traffic to East Africa via some other path because the Swisscom cable was down. We didn't have enough capacity into the country. So we pulled up a GigE circuit between Kenya and South Africa, which is a direct circuit, 50-odd millisecond latency, started pushing all the V4 routes, etc., from Kenya into the Johannesburg Internet Exchange, all our Zambian, Zimbabwean routes, etc., into the Kenyan Internet Exchange. And once that was all working, at the same time, we had to remove another Alcatel in South Africa and cut it over to connect directly to the Liquid stuff. So we decommissioned a point of presence in South Africa, the actual original KDN POP. And once that was done, we were in a position to turn up the V6. And the V6 turn up was really simple. Go into the interface, put the address on it, check that you can ping, and then configure some BGP. It's exactly the way you would do the V4, so pretty simple.
Great to hear. That's great. So what's next for you as far as rolling out IPv6 access for businesses or residences, or what are you looking at in that regard?
Well, in Zimbabwe and in Zambia, it's already there to the access layer. A customer requests it, it's there. We can give it to them. In Kenya, it's a case of getting the new IP network in there first. At the moment, look, when you've bought a network the size of KDN and the East African assets that have been acquired, you are dealing with a very, very large network. And one of the strategies that we've come up with is, rather than take the current network and try and kind of patch it to where we want and then link it into the current liquid network, is to simply build a new, much higher speed backbone between Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Mozambique, etc. And as we build that new backbone, it's being V6 enabled to the edge, and the customers will be able to come to us and say, we want IPv6, and we'll be able to provide it. With regards to time frames on that new network, I can tell you that we're moving incredibly quickly, to the point where we are decommissioning older equipment, etc. As we speak. Stuff has already come out. We've switched around transit providers, all sorts of things, just in the last 2 months alone. I would say that that new network, by the end of the year, you will see everything completely deployed, if not part of it before then. So, yeah.
Great, thanks.
Okay, next question from Bradford Smith. Okay, he's put it in the chat. Okay, Andrew, the question is, how long before IPv6 is available for all the public and will be offered by carriers? Also, when do you see this being available for colleges and other organizations?
Okay.
That might be a generic question, but yeah.
With regards to the public, I can't speak to the other providers. I'd love to be able to speak for them, but I can't do that. But for Liquid, as I said, Zimbabwe, Zambia, any client of Liquids in Zimbabwe and Zambia and South Africa can request it today. It's there. In Kenya, I would say within the next 6 months, hopefully a fair bit sooner than that, customers will be able to get IPv6. A lot of them can already, because we're in a position to provide it to customers who are in Nairobi, who are doing BGP with us. We can accept V6 BGP announcements, do IP transit for V6. So it also depends on the service. But I would say that anything that we offer on V4 will be available on V6 by the end of the year.
Okay.
With regards to the question about colleges, let me just answer that one as well. Sorry, I slipped that one. That is up to the national academic networks. For a lot of the national academic networks in Africa, and this is just something I can touch on outside of Liquid, they're already ready to do that. The UbuntuNet backbone carries V6, it supports V6. Tenet does native V6 in South Africa for their academic network, and there's an institution there that runs 60% of its traffic on IPv6. Tenet is announcing V6 in Kenya, so it's up to the national academic networks now. But the actual backbone for academia in Africa, that does support V6.
Okay, next question, Daniel Akwasi. Daniel, are you there?
Hello?
Yes, Daniel, go ahead.
Okay. I joined a bit late, but getting to the latter part of the presentation, I saw that implementation has started at the South Africa and some of the Eastern Africa. So I want to know, what plans do you have for those of us at the West Africa?
With regards to Liquid and West African strategy, unfortunately, I can't speak to that. That question would have to be addressed probably to Ben Roberts, the Director of Network Strategy. I'm not sure what Liquid's plans are for West Africa at this point.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Next question, Seyum. Seyum, are you there?
Hello? Hello?
Yes,
Hi.
okay.
Is that Sherry? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's nice presentation. Thank you, Andrew. And here is my question. How can you overcome the problem for those protocols which doesn't have IPv6 versions like MPLS, VPN, and other protocols? You have mentioned that they doesn't have IPv6 version. So how can you overcome those problems? And
Okay.
the next question is, does Swisscom support IPv6? Because I'm from Ethiopia and our gateway is connected to Swisscom.
Okay.
Thank you.
First of all, with regards to the protocol issues, it's a fairly generic question you ask there, and it's quite difficult to answer because it depends on the situation. If you're dealing with a complete lack of protocol support in a particular area, or if you're dealing with a interoperability problem. And I think each issue, as we find them, we look at and we go, how do we find a workaround to this? And obviously, at the same time, you apply some pressure on the vendor and you hope that the vendor listens. You know, for example, when I said that Howie, for example, didn't support V6 on their SVIs, the answer was to use sub-interfaces. It requires a little bit of tweaking of the network and the design to get it to work properly, but it's a matter of addressing each challenge one by one. With regards to things like the MPLS, you can at the moment, for example, build a VPLS domain on V4 and the customers are still going to be able to run V6 on their hardware within the VPLS domain because you're sitting in a situation where that becomes a layer 2 domain from your perspective and not a layer 3 perspective. So it doesn't necessarily affect the customers. With regards to layer 3 VPNs, case by case scenario, you know. With regards to Swisscom, I cannot speak for Swisscom's IP network and their transit, and I won't attempt to. With regards to their actual undersea cable, when you're talking about layer 1, layer 2, that stuff is agnostic of V6. So if you're buying SDH circuits, be it from WAX, be it from WIOC, be it from Swisscom, be it Teams, be it Lion, anything, it's all dependent on the equipment on either end. So your equipment would need to support it, and the person's equipment on the other end, be it yours or your providers, would need to support it in order to do V6 over it natively. That's not actually a function of the cable system. With regards to the IP transit, though, on Swisscom's network, that I cannot speak to.
Thank you.
Okay, Nasruddin, do you have a mic? Seyum, kindly mute so that you can get the next one. Okay, let me just ask. He's put the question in chat. There is Nasruddin Suleiman. He's asking, I want to know if there's any criteria for a country to be in the IPv6 plan, because he had you mention DRCs in the list.
The list that I gave there is basically every country that Liquid is operating in. So where we have network or building networks or have network assets, then the V6 plan applies. As I said, V6 is not something that we consider special as such. It's part of the network rollout. So every country that I mentioned there is where Liquid is either operating or it will shortly be operating with fixed plans at the moment. And therefore, if there is such a plan to operate there, there is a plan for V6 there.
Okay, then his second question is, does one have to change his hardware in order to get IPv6 service if it does not support?
That entirely depends on the hardware and what the options are available for that hardware for firmware upgrades. For example, if you were to take a 7200 series Cisco router as a random example, and you deploy a really old iOS version on it, you're not going to get any IPv6 on it. But a firmware upgrade on that and an iOS upgrade is going to give you IPv6. However, if you've got something like a Netgear router that you can't get ready firmware upgrades for, if it's not there, it's not there, and then you've got to replace the device. So that is entirely dependent on the specific device.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. One last question from me before we go. When you assign, when LTE assigns an IPv6 block to a customer, so when you assign like a /48, what do you do for the customer? Do you advise him to get his own IPv6 block, or is your policy to maintain the customer with the portion of IPv6 block that belongs to LTE?
We will generally maintain with the V6 block that belongs to LTE. It allows for nice aggregation. It's a single announcement. If the customer is announcing BGP, though, to us, then they should probably have their own IPv6 space, because you don't want the same space split up and announced from multiple ASNs, where you start getting de-aggregate /48 blocks out of the LIR pool going out as PI assignments, because it's probably going to get filtered anyway. So if they're announcing BGP, then generally they should have their own. If they're not, then we will give them space and maintain it.
Okay, thanks, Andrew.
Thanks so much, guys, for having us.
Yeah, thanks for the very good presentation. We will release you now. Thank you very much for the presentation, Andrew.
Thanks, Kevin. Cheers, guys.
Okay, bye. So up next, we have Dan York of Deploy 360. Let me just put his presentation. Let me just undo.
Thank you, Kevin.
Okay.
Thank you, Kevin, for having me here to join this webinar, and greetings to all of you across Africa and everywhere else who may be listening in. My name is Dan York. I work for a project at the Internet Society called the Deploy 360 program. Some of you may have been to our site. It's at www.internetsociety.org/deploy360. And our focus is around providing real-world deployment information about IPv6, DNSSEC, and also routing technologies, specifically around routing resiliency, routing security. And Kevin asked me to come here and speak about World IPv6 launch and what's happening there. So World IPv6 launch, of course, happened last year, June 6, 2012, and so today we are celebrating the one-year anniversary of that event. It was an event that was organized by some of my colleagues here at the Internet Society, were some of the key organizers, but it involved partners from around the world, large companies, large access providers, large websites, and many others, and it was an event that happened then. If we go back and think about why and what we were doing with that, the point was really to prove, as the speaker before just talked about, really, that IPv6 is just part of doing business. It's really the new normal, if you will, of how we work with IP and work with that. The event was targeted, as the slide says, at access networks, operators, at home router vendors, websites, really with the point of helping provide a mechanism to accelerate IPv6 usage and to encourage people to adopt it. Now, if we look at what has happened a year on, my colleagues Matt Ford and Phil Roberts just posted some blog posts up today on over the last couple of days on the Tech Matters blog on the internetsociety.org site. And they talk there really about what some of these measurements are, and I'm going to show some of those in the next couple of slides. The key points are that global IPv6 use has really doubled among the participants that were there, with, as you'll see, some much higher percentages coming out of the traffic that's there. Major parts of the internet are IPv6 enabled, and as the previous speaker spoke about, there are people who are already looking at how do they move to having IPv6 only deployments, largely because the regions that they are in are the regions where they're running out of IPv4 addresses. So let's look at this. Here's a graph coming out of Google. Now, Google is doing some measurements in the percentage of traffic hitting their services and their sites over IPv6. So what you're seeing here is this very stark trend of the graph going up. from where it was last year and driving up to where it is now. Now, it's a doubling of the percentage and the right growth path. It's still, yes, it's still down there, a small percentage of actual traffic hitting Google sites from IPv6. But it's a doubling that we've seen and a very nice trend of what we're going, and we have no reason to suspect that will not continue at those current rates. It's really striking as we see some of the next slides that talk about what's going on in here. Akamai similarly saw effectively a doubling in the amount of hits to their CDNs, their content delivery networks, the services that were there. And you can, on these slides, which will be available later, I also have the links to where you can see these statistics yourself. So again, the key points, Google has seen that the IP traffic to their sites has doubled in the past year. And Akamai has seen a 250% growth rate in the number of requests that since this time last year. We'll also see, as we'll see in some of the next shots, that the number of network operators have reporting very high percentages and drop in changes over time. Here's a growth chart coming out of an internet peering point in Germany, where they've seen this trend. This is going over 3 years. You can see that it started out from pretty much nothing on a nice growth path and continuing a significant trend up and to the right, which is what, of course, we like to see. Here's another one, which very well might have had a lot to do with our last speaker. We noticed this in looking at some of the charts. There's a chart that showed the axis coming from Kenya. And you could see over here there's a significant jump in the last little bit of people coming into Google's properties from over IPv6 from networks in Kenya. And that I'm sure had a lot to do with our last speaker and the work that was being done there in Kenya to enable some of that activity. We now should see even more of that as he rolls out those, they continue to roll out those IPv6 backbones he was talking about in that last presentation. We're also seeing a growth in the percentage of networks that are announcing IPv6. This chart from an infographic that we released this week at worldipv6launch.org/infographic shows the number of networks that are now, the percentage of networks that are announcing an IPv6 prefix. Basically means that they have they're announcing that they have IPv6 capability within the network. And you can see the range of numbers that are in there, ranging from the Americas, Latin America, Europe, Asia Pacific, and Africa. They're showing, in the case of Africa, 14.4% of the networks at the time that this graphic were made were announcing IPv6 capabilities across the continent. As I mentioned, we're seeing a strong momentum. This is the 3rd year in a row that the number of IPv6 users have doubled, the percentage of IPv6 users has doubled, and so I think we'll continue to see, as we see that, if we forecast that trend out, it would show us growing significantly over the next couple of years, and we'll have to see how that goes. But it's certainly a strong trend that we're seeing throughout over the past 3 years here. When we talk about access networks that were part of World IPv6 launch, at the beginning it was companies AT&T, Comcast, Free, Time Warner Cable, Access for All. We had last year about 69 networks that were that achieved a measurable amount, that were part of the measurements that we're doing. We now are up to 110 networks globally that are doing this, 110 service providers who are reporting their measurements in some way. And there have been some very significant deployments that are happening. In Europe, in South America, Asia, you'll see a chart coming up shortly about Swisscom, for instance, in the deployment they've recently done. We have a site called worldipv6launch.org/measurements. And if you go there, you'll see the measurements that are being reported or that are being measured from a variety of access networks. And now, just to understand what's happening, these measurements are taking place from Google, Facebook, and Yahoo. Those 3 major content providers have partnered with us to obtain these measurements. So they're measuring the amount of connections that are coming into their sites over IPv6 and reporting that back. And so what you're seeing is the percentage of users from those networks that are hitting those major content sites over IPv6. And if you look down that list, you can see some rather large numbers that are coming through. 9% off of AT&T. If you look at Verizon Wireless, it's almost 31%. I'll talk about that more in a minute. You're seeing from Comcast, Swisscom, others that are there. So we're seeing some very large percentages of traffic coming off of these networks to these IPv6 enabled websites that are out there. If I sort that list by the percentage of deployment, you'll again see this is a list of the networks that are participating in the World IPv6 launch measurements, and you're seeing what the amount of IPv6 that is being seen from their networks by these content sites. So again, you're seeing them from somewhat predictably from some of the universities that are in here. SPAWAR is a U.S. Department of Defense network, which has been pushing IPv6 and working with a lot of theirs. DreamHost is a hosting provider, is a network provider in there, and Hurricane Electric, another one as well. So you're seeing some very real percentages of traffic that is IPv6 that's happening out there. It's going out to these content sites that are there. If we look again at the Verizon wireless number, we look at what's happening there. This is primarily happening because they're rolling out LTE within their mobile networks, and they're using IPv6 as a base. So what's making this trend line happen is that people are getting IPv6 enabled devices. If they've got a smartphone of some form, whether it's an iPhone or whether it's any of the Android devices, they all just work with IPv6 by default. And so those devices on a network that works with IPv6 are connecting to sites that are IPv6 enabled, and it's just working. You know, to the point that the previous speaker made, on a certain level, consumers, users shouldn't care. The users who are using their phones on Verizon's LTE network, they don't know they're doing anything. They're just going to Google, to YouTube, they're going to Facebook, they're streaming items off of Netflix, they're doing whatever they may be doing normally. But underneath that, the combination of the IPv6 enabled smartphone, the network, and the site is making it so that all of that traffic is moving over IPv6. So again, from a user perspective, they're just going to Facebook and entering in updates. Underneath all that, it's all happening over IPv6. Similarly, we saw just recently a big spike in Swisscom's deployment. We had a little bit of fun with this about talking about Google maintains statistics on the amount of IPv6 traffic they're seeing from various different countries, in addition to seeing it from networks. And for a while, Romania was having the highest percentage of traffic coming in to Google sites. And just recently, Switzerland passed by them. And this is why Swisscom, one of the network operators there, rolled out IPv6 in their environment again. So we're seeing very real and very serious deployments are happening out there. Another aspect of World IPv6 launch was focusing on home router vendors, on ensuring that home routers that people use would be able to work with IPv6. So for the residential market in particular, it started out with Cisco and D-Link, but over the past year, there's been an additional 8 other home router vendors that have gone through a certification process that right now is focused at the University of New Hampshire Interoperability Lab, UNHIOL, but is also moving out to other testing labs as well. And the focus around this, to be part of the program, was to indicate that most of your products are shipping with IPv6 and that it was an on by default and involved no user configuration. So it's a great start. We're seeing a good number of these devices out there. Obviously, there's a lot more that are out in the market, and so we do have a good bit of work still to see some of that happening, but it's a good start with what we're seeing. And the link on the screen, and that will be in the slides, can get you to that list of devices, as well as the information about how to get more involved with that program. On the website side, as I've already talked about, there's a significant number of companies that made the move as part of World IPv6 launch to provide their services over IPv6 and to enable it permanently. At the time of the launch, there were over 2,300 websites that had turned up IPv6 for the 2012 launch, actually there. And it was their main website. It was not a special website, and it was just enabled. We're already seeing that. We're seeing some statistics around 10% of the Alexa Top 100 sites are serving that. Cisco has their 6 lab where they're tracking some of these statistics and putting up some nice graphs of the world where websites are reachable over IPv6. And you can see from there, there's a good amount of accessibility happening around the world in different areas. You can see in Africa, it's a little bit spotty in some parts there, but that provides a baseline for where things can grow, certainly. But you're seeing people are reaching these websites. They are accessible over IPv6, and it's happening at this point in time. So to kind of summarize a bit of this, we're seeing now the outcome of World IPv6 launch a year ago was that we do now have websites that are accessible over IPv6 continuously. ISPs around the world are starting to deploy that. We heard that this morning on the previous announcement that IPv6 is now being deployed between Kenya and South Africa and will be deployed in other parts of that region. And to the previous speaker's point, IPv4 is effectively gone in many parts of the world. You cannot get easily more IPv4 addresses in Europe or in Asia Pacific. In North America, the time frames are probably next year. We'll see a run out there. But to the point that the previous speaker made, as networks and operators are increasingly unable to obtain IPv4 addresses, they are increasingly going to be looking at how do they move to IPv6 only networks, or how do they make more of the content accessible over that. There'll still be ways, proxies, ways to interact with IPv4 content or IPv4 users, but you will see latency. You will see, delays as the content is put behind proxy servers and other pieces like that. And so it will become important for networks to move to IPv6 to be able to have true native IPv6 access to those websites and those services because they don't want to be caught in that delay. You're also seeing people looking at other alternatives, things such as carrier-grade NAT or CGN, which is a way to put an entire network operator, entire access provider behind a single IPv4 address or a few IPv4 addresses. And this is possible. People are deploying it in some areas, but they're also running into some serious barriers. There's a cost factor of implementing the CGN and the equipment, the gateways that are needed there. There's also issues involved with tracking, being able to log connections, being able to work with that, being able to identify customers, be able to help customers in those environments, and also some very real issues, as I mentioned before, with regard to latency as it comes into real-time communications, to voice, to video, to games. There are some issues where people found that Xbox games were not playable in certain CGN configurations. And so that's not really a viable solution. And so the solution really is to look at how we move to IPv6. And so that's happening right now as we see that. So what's next from a World IPv6 launch perspective is that today is obviously the 1-year anniversary. We're doing a good bit online with publishing new content, new tutorials, new information. There's a good bit of articles coming around from partners and from people all over the world talking about how they are moving forward with IPv6. We're also continuing our effort around measurements. And this URL on the slides, worldipv6launch.org/measurements, will show you the ongoing measurements that we're seeing. We are, on a monthly basis, putting up new measurements that we're gathering, again, from Google, Facebook, Yahoo, and some others. We are looking for other people to participate in that measurements process in 2 ways. One is that we're looking for other people and other networks who are doing large-scale measurements to be involved with that process. We also are looking for network operators, if they're rolling out IPv6, to sign up and be part of this measurements effort that's going on. I also put up a link here from our Deploy 360 site. We have a link to a number of the other statistics sites, including some of the ones that I've shown here. There's a number of different people who've been creating statistics for a while. A gentleman named Eric Vink has a whole series of different statistics that he's generating on a daily basis. Lars Eggert, the Cisco 6 Lab, APNIC, a number of different places are creating these things. So let's go and take a look at that. So actions you can take, certainly. Well, first of all, deploy IPv6. Look at how it works within your network. And I would say to you there's a couple aspects to this. Part of it is getting the IPv6 connectivity into your environment, whether it is your network, whether it's your home environment, whatever it may be. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that, either getting the connectivity directly from your access providers or looking at tunneled IP solutions. Where I am, I live in New Hampshire in the United States, up in the Boston area, and in my particular town, my access provider doesn't have IPv6, but I'm using a tunneled connection from one of the tunneled providers out there that provides me with IPv6 access here in my home network. And so I've set my network up with that. And there's a number of tutorials out there that explain how to do that so that all my devices are able to work within my home network here and be able to use IPv6 using a tunneled connection. So that's an access level. There's also a point of looking at, are your websites and are your DNS services, are those provided over IPv6? Many hosting providers increasingly are providing ways that you can use that you can enable your web content over to be accessible over IPv6. And in fact, we just published on our Deploy 360 site a tutorial this morning about making content available over IPv6, which talks about a number of different ways you can do that, either using native IPv6 or load balancing, IPv6 to IPv4 proxy servers, NAT64, a number of different mechanisms. And so it's a very useful tutorial for people who are looking at how can they go and make the content available. As I mentioned earlier, you also can, we are encouraging operators to participate in our measurements. If you are a network operator and you're deploying IPv6 in some way, we would strongly encourage you, please sign up on this URL here. It's www.worldipv6launch.org/form, and there's a link there for network operators, and you can just go and fill out that form, and then the sites that are doing these measurements will start to, watch your network and see what percentage of traffic is coming from your network that is IPv6. And so you'll be helping us on a larger level with gathering these measurements, understanding what's the true extent of IPv6 deployment, and see where you can go from there. Another way you can help with World IPv6 Launch in particular is promote it. Let people know that this is happening. We've got a link on the slides to where you can download some of this artwork, some of the graphics and images, and use those to promote the fact that IPv6 is now, it is the new normal. Businesses are moving there. They have to move there because we simply have no more IPv4 addresses. And as we bring the next 5 billion people online, we need more addresses. And as people have more and more devices, and as we look at putting out more sensors, more Internet of Things, and other devices, we need to make this move. So I think that wraps up my time, except to say the Deploy 360 program, of which I am a part, is here to help you. We have a number of different tutorials and resources out there, ranging from specific documents to video tutorials to other pieces. They're there. Please use us. We're a resource to help you move to IPv6. If you look on the site and you don't find anything, you can simply send us feedback and say you wish we had this, you would like to have more information about that, and our job is to go and find those types of resources and put them up there and help you all out. We're also looking for case studies and content. I think I will probably be speaking to the gentleman who was the previous speaker and to see if we can talk to them a bit about what they've done as far as a case study. We'd like to showcase more people who are doing these kind of things. So I would leave it to you to think about as well. If you are rolling out IPv6, would you be interested in being a case study or having us talk a little bit about what you're doing? So that's it. I have a few minutes remaining. I will open it to questions.
Thanks, Dan, for that very informative presentation. There are some questions already. I will start with someone whose mic is not working. His name is Surafel Berhanu. He asks, is there any problem experienced on the deployment of IPv6?
Are there any problems?
Are there any problems experienced in the deployment of IPv6? I think he wants to know what are the main issues, main problems experienced during deployment.
Sure. So there are a couple different issues, a couple different places where there are challenges. One is sort of to the point that the previous speaker had made as well, is the issue of getting the actual deployment or getting the actual access connection coming down from above. And that is one of the challenges. It's increasingly less as we both have tunneled approaches and more service providers are getting in there. The other, another more fundamental challenge is looking at consumer equipment, and that was why in World IPv6 Launch we focused on home routers a bit, because for consumers, if they get an IPv6 connection coming into their home, or even a business having it come in there, it's great if they've got IPv6 to their network access point, but if they don't have devices on the inside that can work with IPv6, it doesn't do them much good. Now, most routers for businesses, most enterprise routers and devices have had IPv6 for years, and most operating systems, most of the Windows operating systems, Mac OS, Linux, those have all supported IPv6 for years. So, but it becomes a particular issue in residences because many of the smaller, the home routers, the boxes that you would connect to your network, your internet connection, those have not necessarily supported IPv6. And so part of our push last year and the continuing push is to encourage those devices to go and do that. Some older equipment does not support IPv6, and some applications don't support IPv6, and that is Another area, some applications do require IPv4, and so they don't work with that. Most environments, as people move out, are moving into a dual stacked environment where they have both an IPv4 and IPv6 connection. And so many of these issues are less so, but you do need to have that infrastructure. So the key points are, does your access provider give you IPv6? Can your home routers or other basic, network infrastructure equipment, does it support IPv6? And do applications that are critical for your usage, do they support IPv6? And those are really the three main areas you need to look at.
Thanks, Dan. There's a question from Christian. Christian, are you ready? It's clear. Yeah. Okay.
Kevin, I didn't have any question, but thanks to
there's another question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, yes, Christian, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I just wanted to confirm something because while I was listening to the presentation, I heard about the traffic to Yahoo, Google, and Facebook. So I was wondering, the measurement of IPv6 statistics, is it only based on the traffic that goes down to Yahoo, Google, and Facebook? Does it mean they're not measuring traffic from IPv6 that is going to other networks apart from V3? That's the question.
I'm sorry, I got that there was a question about the measurement of IPv6 by Google, Facebook, and so, but I'm not quite sure what the question was.
No, what I'm asking, can you hear me? Hello?
I'm here.
Okay, so what I'm asking is the measurement of IPv6 statistics that you give to us, because I thought you gave us some graphs giving us measurements of the use of IPv6 by different networks. Is it only based on traffic that goes to Yahoo, Google, and Facebook?
Okay. So the measurements that we have on, so I think the question was, is the measurements that I'm showing here only for traffic going to Google, Facebook, and Yahoo? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So the measurements that we are showing on the worldipv6launch.org/measurement site, that is from traffic going to Google, Facebook, Yahoo, and there's a couple other folks who are involved with that who are providing the measurement mechanisms there. Now, this is just our set of statistics that we're showing. Now, there are a number of other different folks who are also providing statistics showing IPv6 connectivity through other measurements. The folks at AFRINIC, for instance, have a mechanism where they're doing a lot of measurements using some advertising on web browsers and some different pieces that are there. The folks at the RIPE NCC have a whole series of their Atlas probes out of which they are generating some statistics around IPv6 connectivity. So there's a range of statistics. The ones I was showing today and highlighting come from the partners who are working with us on the World IPv6 Launch.org measurements, but those are not the only ones that are out there.
Okay, so meaning that is it possible to have a holistic view of statistics on IPv6 if you don't concentrate on only some providers like Yahoo, Google, and Facebook, like you have mentioned? Is it possible to have a holistic view of the measurement of IPv6 use? Is it possible?
That's one of the challenges is how to go and do that measurement, because you need different points to go and measure it, or you need companies that can report their own amount of usage, the amount of traffic they see through it. So with the distributed, decentralized nature of the internet, it's not necessarily easy to just go and have a master point of being able to see that. So we need to measure it from a large number of points in different mechanisms, which is why you see these different approaches. And on the one hand, the approach we're working with, where we have these major sites that are showing the amount of traffic they're seeing, which gives you a good view of kind of general user usage of that. You also have others, for instance, again, I'll go back to the RIPE NCC project, where they have their Atlas probes, where they have actually deployed physical probes out into various different people's networks, and those are deployed around the world, and they're measuring the data coming from those different points. The AFRINIC folks are doing it through a different mechanism, putting an ad that appears in in browsers. So as people are visiting websites, they're sending data back to APNIC for some of this tracking. So there's not one immediate way to go and do that. And so as a result, there's a number of different approaches that people are using. The trend around all of them is showing an increased usage of IPv6.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I have a question, Dan. Could you just give the perspective of in Asia and in North America where there is no more IPv4 space? What does it mean for the new users who are just getting connected on IPv6 and want to access something that's probably in Africa in an IPv4 network? What does it mean for them?
If you look at regions where you are, a couple different parts to that question. So if you're in Asia Pacific, let's say, and you're a new user on that environment, the challenge that an access provider has is if they're going to give you a new connection to the internet, they have to get an address from somewhere. And the two approaches are either to go IPv6 only or to give you an IPv6 address, and or to give you an IPv4 address using some kind of carrier-grade NAT or something to go and make, provide more addresses. The net of it is, though, you have to go through some kind of gateways to get to the IPv4 content that's out there. Because if they turn up a network that is IPv6 only, the good news is that those folks can get to a lot of the the major sites that are out there on the web. They can get to Google's properties. They can use Google services. They can use YouTube. They can use all those different kinds of places out there. They can go to Facebook. They can go to Yahoo, Wikipedia, Microsoft Bing, a wide range of the different services that are out there. And they can get to those sites without any kind of problem. They may have firewalls, and they're not going through any kind of proxies or gateways that would cause delay. When those new users need to go to v4 only sites, they have to go through some kind of proxy server, some kind of gateway. Now, typically in a service provider environment, that would be on the edge of the service provider's network. So they'd be IPv6 inside their own network, and then they go to the edge and they convert to v4 and go out to the other site there. So that proxy server, that gateway, adds a delay. It adds some latency to it. Now, it might be just a tiny amount, but you do that a lot, and you could have these kinds of delays in getting to the content. So to your point, if they're going to sites in Africa that only have IPv4, increasingly those IPv6 networks will have some kind of delay in getting to the content that's there. As those sites in Africa move to IPv6, they then be accessible by these people on these newer networks who are doing that. And if you think about that, most estimates put about the number of people online at about 2 or 2.5 billion people, and that means there's another 5 billion people yet to come on from all around the world. And so we will see more and more people coming on, and they're going to have to go to IPv6 type of networks, or they'll be IPv4 but behind CGNs, which are going to create more latency and delays as well. Did that answer it, Kevin?
Yeah, that does. Thanks, Dan. So as an ISP in Asia, you have to think about sort of providing compatibility for IPv4 for customers you've just brought in who purely be on IPv6.
Right. And as Andrew said earlier, he can't get more IPv4 addresses in Europe, where he's working and doing the kind of things there. So he has to look at, does he, roll out devices that are IPv6 only and then put some kind of proxy on the edge of the network so that they can still talk to the IPv4 websites, or does he try to do some other mechanism to eke out a little bit more IPv4 usage? And so ISPs are looking at that. How do they go and do that? And in Asia Pacific and other areas, they are looking at how do we go and move to IPv6 only. There's a number of people in enterprises and service providers who are looking at how do I move IPv6 only within my data center, run my internal network with IPv6 only, and then again go through proxies or items on the edge to get to the IPv4 internet. So it's definitely something ISPs need to be thinking about. how do they get IPv6 connectivity to be able to not have to go through gateways, to not have to experience latency, and to provide the best service to their customers, and both in terms of customers who are new coming onto their networks, but also customers who are hosting their websites or services with that with the ISP. If they want to make that accessible, that web content that's hosted on their server now, it might just be IPv4, but how do they make that accessible to all of those new people who will be coming on IPv6?
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. I don't see any more questions for Dan. Are there any questions for Dan?
If not, I'll just say thank you very much for having me here. And again, please visit worldipv6launch.org for more information and pieces that are there. And also our Internet Society Deploy 360 site has all sorts of tutorials and information to help you deploy IPv6, and we're here to help you however we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Okay, we can move on to the last presentation. This is from Orange, Uganda. It will be made by Peter. Peter, are you ready? Peter Muhumuza, are you ready?
Hello, Kevin. Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Do you want me to move the slides for you, or hello? I can hear you. Can you hear me? Hello, Peter. Can you hear me? Okay, he's dropped off. Okay, Simon, are you in?
Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me? This is Simon.
Oh, Simon, I can hear you.
Okay. You can't hear Peter?
I can't hear Peter. It looks like his audio is not connected anymore.
Okay. He's going to use my headset.
Okay.
And to do the presentation. Okay.
Okay.
Hello?
Hello?
This is Peter. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. So we're presenting from Orange, Uganda. It's basically an ISP or telco. We don't, as you're going to see from the presentation, it's not much to talk about. So this is what we've done so far. We got IPv6 space a while back, I think in 2010, 2011, it's /32. Being an Orange Group affiliate, we peer with Orange Group in France and in other POPs. That's where we get our IPv6 transit. I just put a picture of a looking glass. You can see our prefix there. I think this was done in a US looking glass. From the AS number. Our AS number is 36991 through France Telecom or Orange Group 5515511. So after advertising this prefix to the internet, we are the first to do this in Uganda. And the Uganda Internet Exchange approached us to provide them transits, just to not transit for IP connectivity, but transit just to reach like the root server at the Uganda Internet Exchange point, to reach other nodes just for management. So we do provide transit for the Uganda Internet Exchange point for IPv6 to the internet, both on IPv4 and IPv6. We did enable our websites You can see the links there. You should be able to visit them on IPv6. We have IPv6 DNS servers. And we're able to provide IPv6 services to our corporate customers and VPN customers. We can do 6PE or 6VPE and just normal internet connections for only our corporate customers. The last bullet, which is I'm going to talk about it again in the last slide. We haven't enabled it for our 3G or LTE customers yet, which is the majority of our business, and I think mostly in Africa and the third world places, most of the access we see growing from the 3G part, from the mobile phone, not from the lease line part. So because it's easy to get internet on the phone on the 3G than on a lease line, because fiber connections are really not very widespread in Uganda, I think, like in many other third world countries. Yeah, so that's our main focus, probably in the next 1 year or two, with the help of course, France Telecom and Christian earlier on in the conference call, to try to move into that area. Just to drill on this slide, to give you a better picture of what the state is. In Uganda, we have got from the ISP and telco perspective, there's need to have IPv6, and in Orange Uganda, we IPv6 ready now, and a few other ISPs are moving into the same direction. Even some ISPs we provide transit for commercial transit. But from the customer perspective, the offices in town, the organizations in town, there's no need, there's no awareness at all why they need IPv6. For this reason, we deployed our IPv6 network a year ago. I think it was a project to be done for the IPv6 Day last year, which we did. But up to now, no single customer has come to us to ask for an IPv6 address. No one seems to understand why they would need to have an IPv6 address, which is I think it's lack of awareness. We don't have a specific advert that's Orange Uganda. We have an IPv6 address, etc. We just were in the news saying we did IPv6, but there wasn't anything specific to tell customers, and there's no need. The customers don't see a need as of now to get IPv6 address space. So that's our challenge, but we're ready. The only part we're not ready is the 3G LTE part. Next slide. Well, I've just done a quick, it's not very visible, but I've done a quick overview, just high-level diagram. On the technical side, we deployed OSPF version 3 for IPv6. We have BGP APLS there, just add the IPv6 address families and doing 6PE, 6VPE. We only did tests, just make sure these work. But like I said before, we don't have any 6VPE customer, but we have some test VPNs that do work. And you can see on the left-hand side the connection to Uganda Internet Exchange Point. We pair with them IPv6, and then we provide transit to reach the IP, the Uganda Internet Exchange Point nodes via France Telecom, but it's just for management purposes, and the root server etc. Yeah, still on the left, you can see our website and DNS IPv6 servers. Yeah, that's just basically the overview. Just briefly, we're running dual stack just to sum it up. At the same time, running protocols BGP, OSPF that are carrying IPv6 protocols. We don't need to do any tunneling because our provider, Orange Group, PeerWeave, is providing us direct IPv6 transit to the internet. So next slide. The next steps is to enable IPv6 for 3G and LTE customers. This is the bulk of our internet traffic. It's still slow. The plans, we don't have a concrete date yet because most of the handsets and so on are not yet IPv6 ready, and we're still going through the couple of options. We can use to do this. So this is our next step. Yeah, so that's basically it. Very basic. Once again, maybe what you would want to take out from my presentation, we are ready, and maybe one or two other ISPs in Uganda are ready IPv6, but from the customer perspective, they don't see, they have many other internet problems. IPv6 is really the last thing they want to do, and they'll ask you questions, why do we need to do this? Probably it will be more like the previous presenters said, when certain parts of the world, like in Asia or in Europe, when they have moved to an IPv6 only, when we get challenges to connect to IPv6 only networks, maybe the customers will see the need to get an IPv6 address, which is there now, free of charge. So that's basically the state of IPv6 in Uganda. Maybe I didn't mention that we do peer on the Uganda Internet Exchange. We do peer with some other ISPs who are IPv6, but right now, even let's say there are 10 to 15 peers, about 3 or 4 appearing on IPv6 on the Uganda Internet Exchange point. So it's still not a priority for some ISPs, and it's not definitely a priority for all customers or all internet, the end user internet users in Uganda. Yeah, so that was my brief presentation. I think the next slide is I'll maybe take questions and maybe suggestions on how to try to move the IPv6 project here in Uganda.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for that presentation, Peter and Simon. I see a question from Hisham.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'm Hisham Ibrahim, AFRINIC IPv6 programmer. I actually have a suggestion to address what you brought up in terms of customers not requesting it. Since you're in Uganda, I've been doing, aside from the technical stuff that I do, I've been attending for the past year a lot of political meetings. And I know for a fact that the Ugandan government is very interested in doing stuff with IPv6. So just as a suggestion, have you probably talked to, I don't know, the regulator or ministry into looking into getting IPv6 into governmental infrastructure? Government is usually one of the biggest spenders in terms of bandwidth and in terms of getting infrastructure up in the country. So if they can get, if you can get like your e-government or some of the governmental platforms up, I think that will kind of move the ball a bit. And I know for a fact that the Ugandan government is very interested in this, and they've been very, very vocal about this at meetings like Wicked and about a bunch of other meetings. So it's just a suggestion that you may want to look into.
Thank you. Yeah, but the Ugandan government is making some moves in that direction. We're actually part of a tender to try to provide internet to the government as a whole. Previously, well, we're trying to get we're part of a tender to get internet to them as like an STM4 as a whole, which I think if we do get it, it's something we will have to interest them to do. Yeah, that's a good suggestion from the government perspective. But also the challenge is the government in Uganda normally talks a lot and does little. They've got seminars, say IPv6, but on the actual ground, doing the actual work, as long as it's not really impacting his day-to-day life, he won't really mind. But I'm sure there are some government officials there we can really talk to. But right now, the only interface that would do that is if we get a tender to give them a connection. Then we'll have definitely talk to them on the IPv6 peering as well.
Hisham again here. I'll probably ping you offline afterwards and try to liaison with some of the people that I know that may help within the government of Uganda.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Peter. I have a question. Looking at the slide where you're showing the IP addresses for the DNS servers, and I'm curious to know how did one, were you around during the migration to IPv6, and also what was your IPv6 numbering policy? Did you just take the IPv4 address and then add it to the IPv6 added the IPv6 prefix you have? Because I see the DNS sub IP looks, the end part just looks like what I would expect to be your IPv4 address.
Yeah, that's correct. The other end part is the IPv4 DNS server. Okay, I see. Yeah.
Were you around during the migration, or is it something you found ongoing?
No, I was around. I was heavily involved in the deployment.
Okay, how long did it take you guys to move all your, is all your equipment on IPv6? How long did it take you to move to IPv6?
It wasn't really a hard, but it wasn't a hard process. It probably took us just a week. It was a matter of preparing a config and pasting it in, and it had no effect on the other IPv4 protocols. So it was quite easy, and we have a relationship with our group, our provider, which is still Orange. So it's quite easy to get the peering up. When it goes down, it's easy to get someone to work on it. So it wasn't really a long process. Probably we could have done it in less time, but it took us about a week. Of course, with proper planning.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Are there any other questions for Orange? Any other questions? Okay, so Maybe I don't know if Dan, are you still on the call? Is Dan York still on the call?
Yes, I am. I just was muted.
Yeah. Okay. Dan, I just had a question. Do you think there'll be a need for another IPv6 global event like the IPv6 launch?
Well, I think we're already there, right? It's already turned on. It's happening. We may do another launch anniversary type of thing like we did this year as far as just helping promote that. But I mean, at this point, the reality is that IPv6 is the new normal of what people are doing. So I think from here on out, it's all IPv6. So I think we'll continue to see that in certain areas of the world. There may be more promotion of it at certain times, and there'll be IPv6 weeks and IPv6 types of activities. But from our perspective, it's happening.
Okay. Will you shift focus to areas that don't have as much IPv6 coverage, or will the plan just to see how things will develop?
Well, I mean, we're certainly working. Our project, the Deploy 360 program, is working with people around the world in all regions, really looking at how we can help people make the move to IPv6, because there's still, for all of the trend lines and the things that are there, it's still a small percentage of overall traffic, and so we're certainly working with people around the world in doing that. And I know some regions and some of our Internet Society chapters are active in regions helping people look at seminars or webinars and things that are doing that. I know that some of the different events and conferences in certain parts of the world are also promoting IPv6 and providing tutorials and things. So I think we'll certainly see activities happen in regions of the world where there is not as much IPv6 connectivity going on. So yes, I think we will see those kind of activities happening. But at a global level, we'll still be very actively working on trying to encourage people to make the move and provide resources, tutorials, documents, whatever we can do to help people make the move, because it's where we need to go.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Are there any further questions before we move on? On the chat, I've added the survey. Kindly fill the survey so that we can move towards improving the webinars. So kindly fill the survey. If there are no further questions for Dan or for Peter, I'd like to thank both Dan and Peter for their very, very useful presentations, and for making time to make the presentations and actually come to the webinar. And I'd also like to thank all of you for joining the webinar. I would kindly ask you to fill the survey. I have put the link on the URL. I hope on the chat. I put the URL on the chat. So please fill that survey. Okay, so thank you very much. We will see you at the next webinar. We will communicate on the various mailing lists on the date of the next webinar. And the slides, the presentations that were used will be emailed also, as well as a link to where you can get a video recording of this webinar. So thank you very much, and see you all at the next webinar. Another reminder, please fill the online survey. Thank you very much.